the circumstance of race or color. So American subnational authoritarianism couldn't get going at all if the Supreme Court had decided to interpret the 15th Amendment in a way that would have struck down all of these southern states, all the games they played to take the vote away from basically all Black men and hundreds of thousands of poor white men. So yeah, no federalism, no subnational authoritarianism. Although on the other hand, no federalism, no country. Federalism is an inescapable, or at least was at the time, an inescapable part of the bargain from 1787. Yeah, so this subnational authoritarianism is among the, in my view, evils we decide to put up with in maintaining a federal regime.
In the 1960s, we get things like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Brown v. Board. So this is the other side of the federal government, right? There's the permissible side that's allowing subnational authoritarianism to grow in the South. And then there's the side that's essentially trying to stamp it out. Can you talk about what the role of the federal government was there in eventually stamping out subnational authoritarianism?
Sure. So you're right. It was absolutely pivotal. To say it a different way, these polities, these states, enclaves of authoritarian rule at the state level were strong and sturdy enough that they weren't going to be destroyed from within. They were attacked from within, right? I think it's useful to think from the 1920s, 30s on of African Americans in these states and a few Southern white leftist pro-democracy forces as launching something like domestic insurgencies on the inside. But these states had a lot of resources, and it really took the federal government to bring them down. That said, the federal government was, as you all probably know, really had to be dragged kicking and screaming to pass things like the Civil and Voting Rights Acts, and Brown v. Board. All of these were kind of nails in the coffin of Southern authoritarianism. None of them would have happened without these domestic internal movements of African Americans trying to democratize from inside.
Now is a great time for a quick break. We'll be right back with Professor Rob Mickey.
Leaders have made promises.
Yes, we can.
Fulfilled some.
With a rapidly growing economy and with millions at home escaping poverty and being lifted into the middle class.
Enacted unpopular policies.
Until MPs vote on Prime Minister May's contentious Brexit bill.
Started revolutions. Became a symbol for change. And at the same time, created bitter divisions.
And we will make America great again.
Which leader is better? Should we put all our eggs in one basket and hope that the next person will put us on a path of sustained economic development? On Project on Political Reform podcast, we uncover the rules of the game that drive the action of these leaders and how they may use these very rules to their advantage. My name is Pranjal Chandra, and over the next few episodes, you will hear from our PPR team and political economists on how the game of politics and development play out around the world. So, join us if you think being either a liberal or a conservative is too limiting. Join us if at some point in the heated political debates you have felt this is nonsensical. Join us if you want to change the conversation from which political party to what political reform.
We're back with Professor Rob Mickey on the main page. I'm Sidhant Wadhera. Dr. Mickey, I want to switch from talking about the history of subnational authoritarianism in the United States to discussing how it relates to current events. And I want to begin by asking this pretty broad question. Do you still see evidence of subnational authoritarianism in America today?
Sure. There's, if anything, it's on the ascendancy. I mean, I kind of think about the history in American democracy in the following, admittedly too schematic way, which is the country finally became a democracy across its entire territory. again, on this very thin, low bar idea of what democracy is, only in the 1970s, once Jim Crow was finally destroyed and something like secure voting rights was delivered. And then we had a good run, a run that we probably don't appreciate enough as an achievement, but that's because as Americans, we've usually underestimated how difficult democracy is to build and maintain. We had about a half century of stable lowercase d democratic politics. 1970 to 2020 is about a half century. Obviously, trouble began brewing before last year, but yeah, we have a lot of states that are now we anti-majoritarian or anti-democratic devices are proliferating so much that it makes sense at least to wonder if states like, say, Wisconsin, North Carolina should be coded as fully democratic.
Can you talk about some of these anti-democratic or anti-majoritarian devices? Are you thinking about things like gerrymandering or voting rights suppression?
No, that's exactly right. So, I mean, usually when I think about democracy, I'm looking at restrictions on the vote. And this has been a movement that's been building since the early 2000s, not coincidentally, the exact same time when a majority of whites began thinking that they were in the numerical minority in the U.S. population. We started to see states in which Republicans had recently taken over one, usually both chambers of the state legislature, trying to make it harder for their political opponents to vote. Are the outcomes of these restrictions on voting racist? Sure. But that's not their motivation. Again, going back to the 1890s, the motivation is really partisan. You know, would the Scott Walker's Wisconsin Republican Party restrict Black people from voting if Blacks voted Republican? No. But it's the devices used to target reliably democratic voting citizens, right? Democrats kind of invented or perfected tools like legislative malapportionment and gerrymandering. I find it a little annoying that liberals in the last few years have discovered these things as great evils, not having much of a problem when their party benefited from them in the, say, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But there is an argument to be made that there's almost a difference in kind in the severity of these devices. So that now, like, I can't spit out the numbers to you, but the share of the voting public that the Wisconsin State House members need to win a majority of the lower chamber of the Wisconsin Assembly, it's much, much less than 50%, right? It's shockingly less. So, yeah, I'm thinking about those kinds of things. I'm also thinking about a new set of maneuvers that are clearly counter-majoritarian that you could almost think of as like, I think of them as analogous to castling in chess. In Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina as well, I think in all of these states, Democrats won pretty close gubernatorial elections in November 2018. And in a month later, in other words, before the new governor was inaugurated, the new Democratic governor, Republican legislatures worked really hard and well to weaken a lot of powers of the incoming Democratic governor, really redrawing the legal authority, restricting the legal authority of governors, of incoming attorneys general, and so on, which was a way you can think about it. These were laws passed to, from the Republican view, weaken the costs of free and fair elections. Well, if we're going to lose that election, let's at least diminish how much it stings by, after the fact, weakening these positions. So that's also pretty disturbing. In my view, what's going on now, though, differs a whole lot from the subnational authoritarianism that I studied. So I don't want to give listeners the sense that this is what's going on now. I'm begging you to read my book. I don't think my book is needed at all. I think what's going on now is very, very different.
So I actually was going to just ask you how you think it's different, and specifically with respect to this idea of a stable subnational authoritarian regime versus an unstable one? Because to me, that seems like one of the bigger distinctions here. But please go ahead and explain the distinction.
No, that's a great point. Right. So the reason why I say I think what's going on now is so different, even than this recent, say, 1960s past, is because it's actually because of the democratization of the American South that federalism has changed so much. And it's not so much that our federal institutions changed or that the federal government has more authority over states, although that's true. Our politics, the way voters think about what elections are important, the way they assess candidates, our politics is so much more nationalized than before you were born, before I was born even. And this is all in part a consequence of the real change in American federalism that occurred across the 20th century. By the time you get to now, states are much, much weaker. They have less responsibility, less authority. But because of that, you have people voting for state legislature, even for city council, which is just nuts. In the city of Ann Arbor, where I live, right, people vote for city council members on the basis of who's more like Bernie, as if the job of Ann Arbor is to develop a comprehensive welfare state, right? But the reason they do that is because we're so used to thinking about all elections through the prism of Washington. So what's so different about the threat of subnational authoritarianism now is that, unlike in the past, right, as I said before, in the past, these stable subnational authoritarian regimes developed because interest within these states wanted them to. So again, to be a little bit too much of an economic reductionist, but only a little bit, I would say that it was the economic interests of large landowners and their buddies who wanted politics to be a certain kind of way. Had nothing to do with Washington. The only thing that had to do with Washington was, would Congress, the presidency, the courts allow them to get rid of free and fair elections, even for men, and so on. Nowadays, things are very different, right? Why is the Republican Party of Michigan or Wisconsin seemingly more hostile to democracy than it used to be? I think that's because of dynamics happening in Washington. It's this massive, hyper-partisan polarization among Americans who are only thinking about politics through the lens of national level party competition, that these actors are now really fired up to work together across region, right? So if you think about the places I mentioned where democracy is really under threat today, my home state of Texas, state where it's probably the hardest to vote of any state, Wisconsin, North Carolina, these states they're not in the same region. They don't have the same political economies. What do they have? Well, they're all kind of trapped in this same really dysfunctional, highly nationalized party politics that we're all suffering from. So that's the sense in which I think it's national forces that are driving this, and it's also cultural forces. Again, I alluded to this earlier. It's not economic forces at the state level that are encouraging, in Michigan, say, where this one heroic young Republican voted to certify the slate of electors for Biden and Harris a couple months ago. He's now been unnominated to be in that office for the next time, right? Why is the party acting like that? Well, it's not because of economic changes in Michigan. All of this is really going on in part because of the difficulty of a Republican Party that's much more beholden to a far-right economic agenda, needing to find a way to win elections when their agenda is really unpopular. And unfortunately, the way they've sought to do that is by marrying their agenda with this agenda of white nationalism. So for me, it's more this moral panic about demography, about racial equality that's driving actors, whether in DC or in state capitals, in this kind of anti-democratic direction.
I want to go back to that topic we spoke a little bit earlier, which was the interplay between state-sanctioned acts of violence, as you mentioned.